was a cold and lonely evening when the sun began to sink behind the far hills, painting the sky in colors of fire and dust. The poor farmer named Elias walked home from his small field with tired steps. His boots were worn, his hands rough, and his clothes patched in many places. He had worked hard since sunrise, digging the soil, cutting dry grass, and fixing a broken fence that barely held his animals inside. His house was a small wooden cabin with a roof that leaked when it rained, but it was all he had in this wide, empty land. As he reached the gate, his old horse neighed softly, warning him that something unusual was coming from the far road. Elias looked up and saw a cloud of dust rising. He squinted his eyes and realized it wasn't just the wind. A man was running through the tall grass, stumbling, falling, then getting up again. Behind him, several riders were chasing, their horses fast and strong, their faces hard and cruel. Elias could see the flash of their rifles in the last light of day. The man who was running looked terrified and weak, his coat torn, his arm bleeding. Elias felt a quick rush of fear. Bandits often crossed this land, and anyone caught helping their enemies could be beaten or worse. But something inside him wouldn't let him turn away. He dropped his tools and ran toward the fence. When the running man reached him, gasping for air, Elias whispered, "Come this way, quick," and pulled him toward the barn behind the house. The man tried to speak, but Elias only said, "No time, hide in here." They entered the barn, and Elias pushed him into a corner. He threw dry hay and old sacks over him, hiding him from sight. Then Elias quickly wiped the footprints in the dust with his shovel and shut the big barn doors tight. Just a moment later, the riders arrived. The sound of hooves shook the ground, and a harsh voice called out, "Old man, have you seen a stranger run through here?" Elias stepped out slowly, holding his shovel as if he were just working. His heart was beating so fast he could barely breathe, but his voice stayed calm. "No stranger here," he said. "Only me and my work." "I didn't see anyone." The leader of the riders was a tall man with a black hat and eyes that looked sharp as knives. He looked at Elias for a long moment, then at the barn. "What's in there?" he asked. "Hay," Elias replied simply, "and an old horse that can't walk far." The man grunted and dismounted. He kicked open the barn door, looked around, and sniffed the air. The smell of hay and dust filled the space. Elias stood quietly by the door, pretending not to care. The leader's eyes moved over the hay, the walls, and finally back to Elias. After a long moment, he spat on the ground and said, "If I find out you're lying, farmer, I'll burn this place down." Then he climbed back on his horse and the group rode off, their noise fading into the distance. Elias waited until he could no longer hear them. Then he ran back inside the barn and lifted the hay. The hidden man was still there, breathing hard, his face pale. Elias helped him sit up and handed him a cup of water from a bucket nearby. The man drank greedily, then whispered, "You risked your life for me. Why?" Elias sat beside him, wiping sweat from his brow. "Because you looked like a man who needed help," he said softly. "And because no one deserves to be hunted like that." The stranger gave a weak smile. "You don't even know who I am." Elias shook his head. "Don't need to. I just know you're a man." That night, the stranger slept in the loft above the animals while Elias sat near the fire outside, listening to the night wind. The stars were bright and countless, but the silence of the empty land made everything feel heavy. He thought of what could happen if the bandits came back. But deep in his heart, he knew he had done the right thing. In the morning, Elias brought him bread and milk. The man's wound was worse than it had looked, so Elias tore one of his own shirts into strips and tied it around the injured arm. The man winced but thanked him. He introduced himself only as Richard. For the next 3 days, Richard stayed at the farm. He helped Elias in small ways, even though he was weak. He carried buckets of water, mended part of the fence, and fed the chickens. The two men began to talk during meals. Elias learned that Richard had once lived in the city, but he didn't say much more. His manners were gentle and his words careful, like someone who had known wealth and respect. But Elias didn't ask questions. He never cared about a man's past. He only cared about what kind of person he was now. Each evening, they would sit near the old fire pit and watch the sky turn dark. Elias would tell stories of his late father, of years when the crops had grown taller and the land had been kinder. Richard listened quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes looking deep into the fire as if remembering something far away. One night, as they sat together, Richard said, "You have so little and yet you gave so much." Most men would have shut the door. Elias looked at him, puzzled. "When a man's in trouble, you don't count what you have. You just help," Richard smiled faintly. You may not believe it, but you've done more for me than you can imagine." When Richard finally left, his wounds had healed, and his color had returned. Elias saddled the man's horse, which he had kept hidden behind the barn. "Ride north," he said. "The land is safer that way." Richard looked at him with gratitude. "I will never forget this," he said. Elias shrugged, pretending it was nothing. "Kindness doesn't need to be remembered. Just pass it on to the next man who needs it." Richard held out his hand and Elias shook it. Then the man mounted his horse and rode away into the distance until the dust swallowed him. When the sound faded, Elias stood alone by the gate, feeling strangely empty. The days after that were quiet. The field still needed plowing, the animals still needed feeding, and the roof still leaked when it rained. But sometimes when the wind blew from the north, Elias would look toward the horizon and wonder where that stranger had gone, and if he was safe. He didn't know that his small act of courage, one simple choice to help, would soon change his life in ways he could never dream of. He went on with his days, never speaking of the incident to anyone, not even the storekeeper in town. To him, it was just something any decent man should have done. But far away, the man he had saved was remembering every word, every gesture, and every kindness. For Elias, the world remained simple. Wake up with the sun, work until dark, and be grateful for what little he had. Yet somewhere deep in his heart, he carried a quiet satisfaction. The kind that comes when a person knows they have done something right, even when no one saw it. And though he didn't yet realize it, his life had already begun to turn towards something far greater than the narrow field he worked on each day. The poor farmer had no idea that the stranger he had saved was not just a traveler, but a man whose name was known across the land. A man whose gratitude would soon bring Elias a future that even the richest could envy. But for now, Elias only knew the peace that comes from an honest heart and a warm fire after a long day. And that night, as he closed his tired eyes, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter over his small home, as if the heavens themselves had seen what he had done and silently promised that his kindness would not be forgotten. Days passed after Richard left, and Elias returned to his quiet life. The sun still rose over the hills, and he still tended his small fields, mended fences, and fed his animals. He thought about the man he had helped, wondering if he was safe, if he had reached the town far to the north where the bandits could not find him. But life demanded his attention, and the rhythm of hard work kept his mind busy. Still, every now and then, when he looked at the horizon, he imagined the stranger riding free, unharmed and safe. Then one morning a carriage appeared on the road leading to his small farm. Elias noticed it from a distance. A large black carriage with polished wheels and men dressed in neat suits riding beside it. His heart skipped a beat. Visitors were rare, and people who traveled like this almost always meant business, and business usually brought trouble. He wiped his hands on his pants and walked slowly to the gate, unsure of what to expect. As the carriage stopped, two well-dressed men stepped down and approached him. They were polite, but their eyes held a seriousness that made Elias feel uneasy. "Are you Elias Turner?" one asked.
"Yes," Elias said cautiously, squinting at them.
"Who wants to know?" The man handed him a letter sealed in wax. Elias took it, confused. He broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. As he read, his eyes widened, his hands trembled, and he could hardly believe what he was seeing. The letter stated that the owner of the Granville Ranch, the largest ranch in the country, had transferred full ownership of the property to him. Elias stared at the letter again. He read every word, thinking it might be a trick or some cruel joke. He had never owned anything close to that. His small farm was all he had, and even it was barely enough to support him. The idea that he could now own acres of land, herds of cattle, and a mansion bigger than the town's inn seemed impossible. "There must be a mistake," he stammered. I don't own anything like this." The men nodded and tried to calm him. "It is no mistake," one said. "The previous owner, Mr. Richard Granville, made it very clear before leaving for the city. He wanted you to have this ranch. He said you saved his life, and this is his final wish." Elias fell silent. He remembered the night he had hidden Richard from the bandits, the fear in the stranger's eyes and the sweat on his own hands as he had protected him. He had never asked who the man was or where he came from. He had only done what he thought was right. And now that simple act had changed his life forever. Within days, wagons and helpers arrived to escort Elias to his new property. His old horse came with him, but everything else was replaced with a vast landscape he had never imagined. Rolling hills stretched as far as he could see, rivers sparkled under the sun, and workers waited, ready to follow his orders. Cattle grazed in the fields, barns stood tall and full, and fences enclosed pastures larger than any land Elias had ever worked. When he stepped onto the porch of the main house, he saw Richard waiting for him. The same man he had once hidden in a barn, now dressed in fine clothes, his wounds gone, his hair neat, and a gentle smile on his face. "I told you I would not forget," Richard said quietly. Elias was speechless. He had no words to explain the mixture of shock, gratitude, and disbelief that filled him. I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't need to say anything," Richard replied. "I just wanted you to know that your kindness was not forgotten. You saved my life when you didn't even know who I was, and now I want to give you something that can help you live a better life, a life you deserve." Elias shook his head. "I've done nothing to deserve this. I only did what anyone should do. I just helped a man who needed it." Richard smiled, his eyes softening. "That's exactly why you deserve it. A heart like yours is rare. The world has many people who think only of themselves. You thought of another first. That is worth more than any gold or land, and that is why this ranch is yours now." As the days passed, Elias explored his new land. Every hill, every field, every barn amazed him. He walked among the cattle, checked the fences, and saw the rivers running through the property. Workers approached him, waiting for instructions, and he realized for the first time that people were looking to him for guidance. The poor farmer, who had once struggled to feed himself, now had a responsibility that stretched across miles of land. He felt nervous, but also a sense of pride and purpose he had never known. Richard stayed for a few weeks, teaching Elias how to manage the ranch, introduce new crops, and care for the livestock on a larger scale. But more importantly, he reminded Elias of something deeper. "This ranch is not just land and wealth," he said one evening as they watched the sun set. "It is an opportunity. Use it wisely and remember why you have it. Never forget that a simple act of kindness can change not only your life, but the lives of others too." Elias listened and nodded. He began to understand that his life had changed in more ways than he could have imagined. He was no longer a poor farmer struggling in a small field. He had become a man of responsibility, someone whose choices mattered, someone whose heart had been recognized and rewarded. The villagers soon heard the story of the poor farmer who had helped a wounded man and inherited the nation's largest ranch. They came to visit, bringing congratulations, curiosity, and sometimes envy. But Elias welcomed everyone with the same kindness he had always shown. He remembered the nights when he had little to eat and no one to rely on, and he treated his workers with respect, fairness, and patience. He knew that his wealth meant nothing if he lost the goodness inside him. Over time, the ranch flourished. Cattle multiplied, crops grew tall, and the barns were always full. Elias learned to enjoy the simple pleasures of his new life. Watching the sunrise over golden fields, walking along the riverbanks, listening to the wind rustle through the tall grass. He also found joy in small things he had once taken for granted, laughing with neighbors, sharing meals with workers, and helping those in need, just as he had helped Richard. Years later, people would tell the story of Elias Turner, the poor farmer who once risked his life to save a stranger and became the owner of the greatest ranch in the country. But Elias never thought of it that way. To him, it had always been simple. When someone needs help, give it. The rest will take care of itself. The ranch, the wealth, and the respect came as a result of what he had always believed in. The power of doing good without expecting anything in return. And even as the sun set on another long day, Elias would stand on the porch, looking over the land and quietly smile, not because he owned the largest ranch, but because he had acted with a kind heart when it mattered most. And in that truth he found a happiness deeper than any riches could ever bring. The life of the poor farmer had changed forever, yet he remained the same man inside, a man whose courage and compassion had turned a simple act of mercy into a legacy that would last for generations.